welcome. This is the Wealth Rabbi inviting you to be part of a conversation about bringing truth and values to the world of wealth. And I'm delighted to have with us, as our guest this afternoon, Rabbi Laibl Wolf, Dean of the Spiritgrow Holistic Centre in Melbourne, Australia. So for the last 32 years, Rabbi Wolf has made it his life's work to be a spiritual mentor and a worldwide teacher on the mystical side of Judaism. And one of his great achievements is to take the ancient Jewish teachings of the Kabbalah and make them relevant and applicable to all of us living in the modern world. He's much in demand in the world as a lecturer and keynote speaker. He's also a well-known author. His book, Practical Kabbalah, published by Random House, has been recognized both as an authentic and authoritative introduction as to how to apply the secret teachings of the Kabbalah in our daily lives. And I really recommend the book, so go on Amazon and order it now. Rabbi Wolf is currently on a lecture tour here in the UK. We really appreciate his making the time to talk to us today. This is a particularly and wonderful, rare opportunity for us as he spends most of his time in Australia on the other side of the world. So Rabbi Wolf, a big welcome to you, or to use the classical Jewish greeting, Shalom Aleichem, peace unto you. So how does it feel to be in London?
I'm sure that being in the company of the Queen is quite an honour in the same place. I've generally steered clear of Europe for various reasons, and therefore being here in London is quite refreshing, and I've met wonderful people and I'm very impressed.
Okay, and refreshing in what way, may I ask?
Well, refreshing in terms of a different vantage point, in terms of interfacing with reality, and it just re-supports my contention how different peoples of the world perceive the same reality through so many different ways. In the same way as there's the Jewish adage that there's 70 faces to the Torah, then there's so many different faces to the population of the world.
Interesting. So please tell us more about the work that you're doing as Dean of the Spiritgrow Holistic Centre in Melbourne, Australia.
The centre is a cutting-edge experiment which is quite different than anything that exists in the world, and since I travel to about 65 different cities in the world, I'm always on the lookout for different models of community-type centres. But I don't think there is anything in the way that what we've created. Quite deliberately so, I've identified what in fact are the major trends in the world today and nominated 4 of these in terms of health and wellness is a great quest for people. The capacity to train oneself better in personal management and time management is another arena. To enrich relationships in such a way that there's the quality of happiness that derives from a relational life, that's a 3rd arena. And the 4th arena is spirituality, and spirituality with a small s, because the word spirituality today has so many different connotations. It extends anything from being very sensitive to a green environment, right through to non-animal testing, through to meditation, through dabbling in yoga, also different phenomena that delineates what a spiritual person might well be. So these are the 4 areas that our particular centre deals in, and then the areas of my own personal interest that I tend to share by way of lectures and workshops and the like.
And your particular area of interest is?
The interface of psychology and Hasidic teachings of Kabbalah, primarily, most currently, on whether we can train ourselves to master our consciousness so that we can actually become more aware in the moment and be wiser in our response mechanisms to provocations within life, exigencies in life, situations in life. And I've come up with a training program called Kavanah Mindfulness, which I believe is a really wonderful method of being able to move into this arena of deepening one's life.
And what does Kavanah mean?
It's interesting. The word Kavanah generally from the Hebrew translates as intention, but it derives from the Aramaic kabin, which means window. And therefore, at a more profound level, it means that our body provides a window of opportunity for the soul to be able to peer out into the world of time and space, our world. But that we have a capacity to filter and monitor that mode of reaching out into the world. And by mastering the way we think and mastering the way we feel and balancing them appropriately, it makes for a higher order decision-making process in life.
And that's really fascinating. So, looking back, who would you say have been the major influences in terms of your developing this thinking and this teaching?
There have been influences both in terms of the nature of knowledge of any day in the year, but there's also teachers in terms of the antiquity. What I mean by the former is our capacity to be able to peer into the brain and to recognize the physiology, and through scanning techniques be able to identify the language of communication within the brain called neurotransmittic transmissions. That is one arena which teaches us that basically, if I can put it down to much more simple language, the more you do something, the more you feel something, the more you think something, the more likely you're going to repeat it, because you develop grooves of the brain. Mm-hmm. So that creates habits and automatic responses and default responses. We may not like everything about ourselves. A person may not like the fact that they fly off at a handle when someone provokes them. A person may not like their depressive tendencies or what have you, and yet they're so entrained within there that it's very hard to break out of it. So what I teach people is how to undo these grooves of the brain and be able to create better choice responses and reprogram those. And through the use of understanding of the Hasidic teachings of Kabbalah and the way that we go, for example, fishing in the pond of our subconsciousness through the mechanism known as Chokhmah, drawing out the thoughts from somewhere deep below, but learning how to go fishing in another part of our pond so that our creative process becomes enhanced. Or Bina, the way that we direct a line of thought, and we may be wanting to direct a line of thought elsewhere if we're wiser. And ultimately Da'at, which means where the focus is, where we're taking it to. And once we learn how to focus more appropriately, we awaken much more appropriate feelings, which are the children of our mind flows.
And in terms of the Hasidic masters who you draw on, any in particular that are rich in inspiration for you?
Yeah, by far and large I would nominate the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and also very much the teachings of his seventh generational antecedent, the Alter Rebbe, who I think was absolutely created a new approach to the whole analysis of the psyche of the individual and the nature of the cosmos, based on traditional sources, but put in a much more different model format, which is more contemporary.
Interesting. So I know you're also a lecturer at Melbourne University on Jewish mysticism and spirituality. So how's that going, and how's that kind of dovetail with the work that you're doing in the Jewish community?
It's interesting. I was asked to initiate this program of study of Jewish spirituality, and I was the founding lecturer at Melbourne University in this particular arena. And it began as a comparative analysis between Judaism and Buddhism in terms of spiritual parallels. And I was asked to really exposit my thesis, which isn't mine, it's quite common, that Abrahamic teachings contributed to the beginnings of Buddhism and Hinduism. But in course of that particular activity, on one occasion the Dalai Lama was visiting Australia and expressed the wish to meet with me, and we had the occasion to meet for 2 hours to compare notes as a consequence of that course at Melbourne University.
And how was that encounter for you?
I found it a very interesting encounter. He's a very, very nice gentleman. He's a very, very good person. He's got some really wonderful, refreshing attitudes to creating a better world. At the very same time, he's quite chauvinistic about his Buddhism, and he didn't particularly want to lose his Jewish followers, whereas I asked him to send his Jewish followers back to research their roots. He was not necessarily conforming to that request.
Okay. Now, we don't normally associate Australia with spirituality. You know, here our images, you know, the surfing and the beer, etc. Yeah. Do you think that some societies are more open and hungry for spirituality than others, and where does Australia fall on the spectrum?
I think we're reaching a lot of common ground universally. The communication systems are so integrated fashions of ideas and clothing are moving very quickly and percolating through the same malls in, whether it's in Poland or whether it's in New York or whether it's Melbourne, Australia or Tel Aviv. So the short answer is the complexity of the world is encouraging individuals to rethink what is the raison d'etre of their being. And I therefore think it's a very common quest across the board, and that today you can't really say, oh, these people are more disposed to spirituality, but spirituality with a small s is really a quest by nearly all peoples of the world today.
Right. So, as the Wealth Rabbi, one of the key areas that I'm interested in and I've been focusing on is what does Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism have to teach us about money and our way of being around money. Is this an area that interests you, and how important do you think it is?
I think it's terribly important. At the end of the day, there are many rationales as to what is the motivation of human endeavour. And whereas Freud might have said that it's the libido drive, and Adler says no, it's quest for control and power, and Maslow has his hierarchical model of food, clothing, shelter, followed by self-actualization. At the end of the day, the quest for money is a means to acquire security and the means to gain pleasure. Nevertheless, within the Jewish spiritual teachings, the greatest pleasure that we can gain in life is carried out through the act of sharing and giving. I often ask my clients or audiences, think back to a moment when you really last had a lasting pleasure of great intensity. What was a great moment of enjoyment? And inevitably, the person or persons will respond that it was somewhere in context of an interpersonal setting with a loved one where they were sharing something. Money is ultimately the sum total of our energy input on a daily basis in our creativity and our physical expression, and that's the reward. But if it's the reward alone, you will not have pleasure. It'll become an addiction, and it'll be a further quest for security and a perceived pleasure. It's only when we actually take what we have and share it and contribute it that, ironically, its true value is felt as opposed to intellectualized. So within the Jewish spiritual teachings, the idea is, by all means, quest for money, quest for wealth, but that's not your ultimate goal. It's what you're going to do with it. And if you're going to make the contribution to others and society, then what you're doing is you're taking a share of your real raw energy which went into there, and you're sublimating it into bettering the world, bettering the other person, and that ultimately gives a person the greatest nachas, the greatest joy.
So we've had a lot of controversy here in the press recently around levels of compensation, different CEOs being extremely highly paid in the multi-millions. What's your view of that kind of gap between rich and poor?
I was lecturing to a Fortune 500 convention some couple of years ago in Los Angeles, and this issue also arose. Whether in fact there is some level of morality in terms of the idea of having a disparity between those who have and have-nots, and what is an acceptable disparity. And I think it's a meaningless discussion, what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. I think what's much more important is that if a person finds himself or herself in the good fortune of having a very, very good income, it means that Hashem is entrusting that person with the potential to make a much bigger contribution to others. Now that's the test of the individual. If the person is not a developed human being, then of course he's going to want to have much more and much more in terms of bolstering his own ego and insecurity, and that never ends. But I have a strong belief that God does give wealth to those who have the capacity and potential to use it best, but makes the test for them that's much harder in order to make it a very real test.
Okay, I get you. So I was intrigued to see that you were a recent keynote speaker in Argentina.
Yes.
On the Argentinian economy and psycho-spiritual solutions in Argentina.
Yes.
Now that sounds fascinating. Please tell us more about that.
It's interesting because soon after, and I take absolutely no credit for that, the Argentinian economy really moved very, very fast.
But in which direction?
in a very positive direction. Economy is based on psychology at the end of the day. And I know there's very sophisticated economic theory, but one of the things that strikes me, I leave Australia for 2-3 weeks on end, and then I come back and I read the newspapers, and all the economic predictions that were there 3 weeks ago suddenly are absolutely passé, and there's new positions as to what the future is going to bring. So I think that the one thing we learn from history is we learn nothing from history.
Okay.
Having said that, I think that what the marketing world, and especially public relations world, tries to do is to create a collective psyche that affects the way that the demand processes operate, supply and demand. And therefore I think it's much more important to affect people's perceived values of money and values of their life as a much more positive means to create economic betterment of society than pure pragmatic economic factors and theory per se. And that's why I think teaching people values, teaching people to be, as we say in the Yiddish colloquialism, Menschen, teaching people to feel safe in being charitable, positive and sharing, that I think creates a much greater wealth at the end of the day, both in terms of practical economics as well as creating a higher order people.
So you're saying like the kind of the greater human capital will kind of feed into greater financial capital?
Absolutely.
And that really leads me into my next question, which is, do you think the credit crunch of 2008 and the ensuing recession that we're experiencing in the developed world is a sign of a deeper spiritual malaise?
I think it's a sign of absolute greed, institutional greed. I think that where you have a circumstance where monies are being thrown freely at people, usually by the banking and financial institutions because of the much greater interest gains that they get from their income flow, that is a matter of pure ego and greed, and it must end in a complete disruption of economy, and the bubble must burst. And you don't train anybody by throwing money at them. What we need to do is to have a much better mechanism of training people how to utilize their wealth wisely, to understand what it means to live within means, and also to have institutional responsibility for the welfare of clients, not simply self-serving of the banking industry or financial industry.
So finally, can you give those watching us today one practical piece of advice about how they might improve their personal relationship around their money?
I think there could be no better mechanism to achieve that than to absolutely ensure that you give 1/10 of all your income for the benefit of society and the benefit of people in need. Now, I have seen that over and over again, that over a period of years, the kind of change psychology collectively within an institution. I'll give you an example of how it can operate. In my own life, I've witnessed within my own family situation. I'm not in business, but my brother and my father are in business. And there was a very profound, deep recession in the very late 70s and early 80s. And the business was going under. And my father, my brother, made it a practice that from the company, anyone who is employed at the company, any it's a building construction company, development company, any subcontractor, the first question that's asked before contracts are signed is, do you have any children who are currently being taught in school? And if that's the case, immediately a grant is given within the contract, no matter what the nature of the contract is, for part of the monies to go to the education of the subcontractor or the employee's children. It's just one of the things that the company does. Now, with that background came that recession, and the company was going under. There were a good number of building projects left in incomplete stage, not completed. There was no money to pay to complete it. I remember a meeting being called, by my family of all the various contractors and employees saying we don't have the means to complete these projects and we just have to say goodbye, or we're making a request. Continue working without pay, without the cash flow, and we undertake in due course to pay back every penny. By and large, because of that loyalty and trust that came as a consequence of the giving nature that had been developed over a period of decades already, the projects continued, the people were not paid in the interim, at the end everyone was paid to the last penny, and the company went even to much greater heights of profitability. That the intangibility of creating the trustworthiness and loyalty and sense of belonging through the act of sharing and giving is in the long run a much more powerful tool towards, ironically, wealth development, but not for the purpose of wealth, but wealth servicing the needs of people.
So really what you're saying is by giving, in the end it will come back to you. Giving, the world will give back to you.
Must.
Okay.
Of course, one wants to go beyond that. You don't give in order to get back,
yes,
but giving will eventually reflect the giving back.
Okay, so Rabbi Wolf, many thanks for joining us at Wealth Rabbi and sharing with us your experiences and insights. You've truly helped us in our core mission of bringing truth and values in the world of wealth, so many thanks indeed.
My pleasure. Good to be with you.